It was the one aeroplane I wanted to fly right from when Dad had it in the garden before he rebuilt it. Me and my sister used it as our climbing frame, but it was always the one aeroplane I really wanted to fly.
For the entire century since man first took to the air, the armies and the air forces of the world have exploited the space above them to take their military ambitions into a new dimension. However, when the guns have fallen silent, the engineering and craftsmanship, the skills and knowledge poured into developing these incredible fighting aircraft are frequently cast aside and lost to history. But now we can take you behind locked hangar doors into the secretive world of both the dedicated enthusiasts and big-budget professionals who are spending millions of pounds and thousands of man-hours bringing them back to life. We'll follow 6 forgotten aircraft from rusting wrecks to living, breathing memorials to those who fought and died for their country. These immaculate rebuilds are often against all odds in an impenetrable world of rare finds, intrigue and ingenuity. The research and return to flight of these important aircraft mean these are far from just restorations. These are plane resurrections. In the latter part of World War II, American bombers roared into the air from Eye Airfield in eastern England. Now, just a stone's throw from the end of the runway, the Hammond family run their engineering business, daughter Leah following in the aviation footsteps of her father Morris.
Yeah, in the engineering shop we've got 5 blokes, 3 girls. My mum's our secretary because it's a close-knit family business. There's Lindsay, who's worked for us for probably knocking on 25 years since she left school, and I started there when I left school as well on the commercial engineering side, and we do a lot of vintage aircraft parts and that sort of thing as well. Well, that's mainly manual work done to the old Rolls-Royce or to the North American drawings for Spitfire, Hurricane, Mustangs, and then we get the odd breakdown job for customers during the year that we rush around so they can get back flying again.
Her father's engineering skills have passed down to Leah, and since childhood she has been surrounded by the history and artifacts of the air war in Europe. So she's also picked up Morris's passion for restoring historic aircraft.
Well, there was always an aeroplane project in the hangar in the garden, so I would spend a lot of time out there with him. And then when he got to Harvard, that used to sit in the back garden for a while before he started working on it. And it was kind of mine and my sister's climbing frame. Any time he wasn't around, we used to open the canopies and climb in. And then it went in to be worked on, so we couldn't do that anymore. Always wanted to fly the Harvard. From just sitting in it in the garden, it was always the aeroplane I wanted to fly. And you see the pictures of all the ones flying, and to me it's such a pretty aeroplane, and it's a lot more ladylike than some of the fighters that you get that are just big boys toys. So it's just really graceful and lovely.
Leah's spent all her life in the presence of wartime aircraft, the pilots who flew them, their families and friends. She's absorbed their memories, and with a young family of her own, her thoughts turn to remembering those who went before her.
Yeah, I think it's important. It's my generation and my daughter's generation that we need to educate about it. And a lot of the airfields now, there's not too much left. Take for instance the airfield at Eye, it's all redeveloped into a big industrial estate, but there's not actually a war memorial on the airfield. And that's something I feel is important, and it should be there. Because in generations to come, when all that concrete's gone, the children aren't going to know what was there. So I find it important to raise the money and get the memorials put up. So, you know, and for families from America that come over as well, you know, it was a significant event and it shouldn't be forgotten.
This is the beginning of a routine flight of Army training planes. These cadets are learning fast and will soon be full-fledged flying members of the Army Air Corps. Any young man between the ages of 17 and 26 can enlist in the Army as an aviation cadet for training as a pilot, navigator, or bombardier. Here's a chance to get a ringside seat or better still, a bird's eye view of the big fight. A chance to help the Army Air Forces throw a punch that'll knock Hitler and Tojo bow-legged.
The principal fast-training monoplane that pilots honed their skills on was the big, powerful North American-manufactured tandem two-seater. It bore a number of names, as with many US imports during the war. In the UK, it was the Harvard, for the US AAF, the AT-6 Texan, and for the US Navy, the SNJ.
The Harvard is an AT-6, which stands for Advanced Trainer. So the cadets would learn on Stearman or PT-22, and then they would progress to the Harvard, and then they would probably do 100 hours on Harvard, which really sharpened the pilots up, because once you can handle the Harvard, you can handle most of the big fights. It has some bad voices, the Harvard, and it really catches the students out. So, it is an advanced trainer.
The North American Harvard, a superb aircraft, the consummate trainer, some said. Same family as the North American Mustang. Was it the little sister? Not according to some pilots. Some say that this aircraft was actually harder to fly than the Mustang. But being the consummate trainer, it demanded knowledge from its pilots. No pilot ever flew one of these and didn't learn something. And it's like a fighter aircraft, bigger than a Spitfire. It has power, it had guns. Not many guns, it wasn't a fighter, but you needed guns fitted in it for fighter training. Funnily enough, in this thing, if you look closely, there's no floor in it. You didn't sit in an aeroplane, it flew in a military machine. You wore flying overalls, you didn't drop anything because it would be a foreign object, could jam controls, and you could make a big hole in the ground by a very simple mistake. But it would teach the tyro everything that he would need to know to make the progression to the bigger Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Spitfires, whatever you have. They built over 15,500 Harvards, and there are hundreds still flying today.
Harvards continued in their role well beyond the war and trained many RAF pilots like James Barry Gibbons.
I did my national service, and as I was still interested in aeroplanes, and I was reasonably bright then, they got me to go to Canada, where I was learned to fly, and I was sent out to the province of Alberta, where I learned on piston schools, which is where I learned to fly on a thing called a Harvard, North American Harvard, a great big radial engine thing with a tail wheel, rather difficult to fly. This is my diploma for going out on pistons. You see it says marked distinction, coming the highest in the class. When you open the throttle and take off, this big engine, made the thing swing, and you had to put your correct foot on the thing to stop doing what they call a ground loop. Any aeroplane that had a tail wheel is inherently unstable because the center of gravity is behind the main wheels. If it's a trike, the center of gravity is ahead of the main wheels, and so if you, on takeoff, if you veer off and take your hands off, it will automatically center itself. But with a tail wheel, when you move off center, the center of gravity is behind the main wheels, and so it continues to spin. And that's when you have to put your foot on the brake to make sure that you come back again onto the center of the line. Visibility is very poor because, as you know, it's got a tail wheel, a big engine at the front, and as you were taxiing along, you couldn't see, so you had to snake to see where you were going. But when you took off, the tail wheel came up and you had quite a good view out of the cockpit of the old Harvard. A great privilege to fly it, a great big beast. As I said, it had a 550 horsepower radial engine. By radial it means that the cylinders go round in a circle. In your splendid motor car, they're probably all in line, aren't they? And radial engines, for some reason I've never fully understood, all have an odd number of cylinders in them. And it was a great privilege to fly it. I've got a photograph of Harvards in my logbook, which I've got just down there. and it's wonderful. But it is difficult to fly, and we used to do spins and stall turns and rolls. There were two types of rolls. One was an easy one, which is called just a barrel roll, where you were still pressed into your seat all the way around if you went around a barrel. But the more difficult one was a slow roll, where you rolled round on a straight line, and so when you were upside down you were hanging in your shoulder straps, and that was rather tricky. And you could do stalls, you could do flick rolls, that you go up and then give a big boot on one of the rudders, and the one wing would stall and the other would have lift, and so you'd flick onto your back. So you went into the spin, you'd stick forward, and then if you were spinning one way you had to keep the stick forward to get a bit of speed over the wings, and kick the opposite pedal to stop the aircraft rotating, and then with a bit of luck you pull out. A few of my friends in training were not so lucky. Now that was nothing but fun then.
James H. Dutch Kindleberger, recruited from the Douglas Aircraft Company, became the head of the growing North American Aviation Company. And as the need for Mustangs and Harvards caused the company to grow, plants were opened in Ohio, in California, in Kansas, part of the massive war effort. And North American became legendary in the field of aviation history and aircraft manufacturing in the USA because of the quality of its products, like the Harvard and, more significantly, the war-winning Mustang fighter.
The Harvard was designed in the late 1930s, but benefited from the accelerated production line techniques that became absolutely essential during the war to feed the Allies' war machine. 15,000 of the airframes were produced, and North American aviation introduced strict manufacturing and assembly techniques and standards that had an impact far beyond the factory. The controlled, systematic production meant that when it came to in-theatre repairs, parts could be easily and reliably swapped from one aircraft to another. This level of factory standardization proved vital to the mass production and serviceability of subsequent North American planes, most important amongst them the Harvard's bigger brother, the P-51 Mustang. With call-ups in place, American men went to the front line, and so it became the task of the US government to urge women to fall into the gap at the workplace. Leading the call was poster girl Rosie the Riveter.
Here in this modern supercharger plant, the manpower shortage is being solved by training women to do almost the entire job. Waitresses, sales girls, housewives, all have willingly taken their places in national defense. Outfitted for their training programs, these girls are now ready to tackle the work of producing weapons and equipment essential to our armed forces. Let's start with this big Natco multiple drill. Although this is a big, tough machine, just watch the way Emily, the operator, handles it. Puts it through its paces, lifting the part to be drilled, turning heavy wheels, moving along with the work. That's just the physical part of this job. It takes a lot of skill, too. This work gives you a good idea of what a girl can do. It is estimated that before the end of 1943, industry will hire and train more than 5 million additional women for production jobs like this. Here one girl is teaching another how to operate a Jones and Lamson turret lathe. This is one of the most interesting discoveries made in training women. They actually learn better from other girls already trained rather than from men instructors. So far, the machine shop has been a man's world. At first, the new girl is a little frightened, but when she sees another girl get her hands dirty, sees her actually doing the job easily and efficiently, she learns faster and with greater self-confidence. Out of several thousand employees in this plant, 80% are women. These women are filling America's urgent need for skilled labor. They are more than fulfilling the management's expectations, for this Alice Chalmers supercharger plant, only a few months old, is already weeks ahead of schedule.
Two things about the Harvard. It's probably the most affordable warbird that sort of the normal PPL pilot could reach to, and secondly, there was one available when I started to look. So a friend of mine, Tony Ditheridge of AJD, had 2 Harvards, and we made a phone call and arranged to go and have a look at one, and done the deal, and it arrived duly here on a low loader.
But it'd been in a museum in Portugal, and it got shipped over with another one, and Dad knew he was going to rebuild it from scratch. So everything came off, everything was rebuilt from, original parts, but cleaned up and put back together.
You need to decide how the aircraft's going to look when you're finished it and what standard you want to work to. Well, I think I work to a fairly high standard, like the best an old country boy can do, really. So it's the bead blast, X-ray, the weld clusters on the airframe. Do the monocoque, because the tail cone is a monocoque construction, get inside, and where you find corrosion, remove the metal, and don't repair the panel, replace the whole panel. The girls would come out and need something to do, so we'd give them some parts to clean and some boxes to empty out, dust out, and put them back, and help sometimes with putting the Cleco fasteners, skin pins into the rivet sections and stuff. So they were involved, It was kind of interesting, really, because they used to play on the airplane when it stood in the garden. So I think it was kind of nice for them to see it progress through eventually to leaving the ground.
Well, I was still quite young, so I'd just rather do that than sit and watch the telly. So I would just go and see what he's doing, and he'd give you a panel that needed, rubbing down or whatever before he could paint it or something like that. So I just used to get those sort of little jobs. Or he'd have an assortment of nuts and bolts, and they needed to be all cleaned. That would be my sort of job. But there's quite a lot of Harvards flying, so there's a lot of Harvard spares around, so you can pick up the phone and generally get anything delivered. And being North American, you can just unbolt one off one aeroplane, bolt it straight onto the other aeroplane.
Just work through, really. Start with the fuselage, tail cone, and then you can do tail plane, elevators and rudder fabric covered on the Harvard. So I've already gained fabric experience and knowledge from the Skybolt, which was a fabric airplane. You need to have a knowledge of making jigs and fixtures to hold key components if you're going to dismantle them and replace the skins and stringers and spars and stuff like that. So made all those and put them in the jigs, the various parts and centre sections and stuff, and dismantled, remetaled, riveted it together, learning rivet skills and stuff as we went along.
But I remember spending evenings out in the hangar, helping him with the riveting, holding the bucking bar as he was riveting the other side and tightening all the wing bolts up and things like that.
Yeah, we had several engine runs in the garden here, and then it was a question of slowly pulling the aircraft through into the car park, loading it on a low loader, and then taking it with the police escort to Crowfield. Once at Crowfield, we then assembled the whole airplane. So a whole team of volunteers, and very carefully put the wings on, and slowly went through all the processes of setting the control surfaces and stuff, and ground running engines. Paintwork had to be raised as normal, weight and balance had to be done, various things, ground runs, taxi trials, and a good friend of mine, Colin Edwards, who I'd known for quite a while, he has quite a number of hours on Harvard, agreed to do the test flight. So that day came and filled up the fuel, we both hopped in, Colin started up and off we went.
I remember being scared. Eddie Edwards flew it, did a test flight in it from Crowfield, and I just remembered sitting and watching it fly, and the nerves, I remember the nerves. Even when he test flew the Mustangs afterwards, just that ball of knot in your stomach, because you're watching it go and you're just like, ooh, and you're just waiting and waiting for it to come back again.
I think the first flight was about half an hour, back down on the ground again as you would normally do, cowls off and have a good look round, inspection, and then another flight. No trimming was necessary, so that was a good thing. The airplane flew straight level. So I had it Crowfield for a few weeks, and then we moved to Ipswich, and it was time to have a go on the controls from a larger airfield with crash facilities. So Eddie sat in the back, and we did circuits and various stall configurations at altitude and stuff, and general handling, got to feel for the airplane. And then eventually he said, I'm getting out. So he got out, and going through your mind that you sit on the end of the runway and think, well, here goes nothing, so open the throttle, just do everything that you've been taught to, and you've constructed the airplane, so if you have an in-flight issue, the chances are very good that you would know and understand what the problem is. But yeah, as you sit there and take off and go through the motions of what you normally do and fly around and enjoy yourself, and think, well, if I get in a muddle here, there's only one person going to sort out. So that's you're going to think that you put every nut and bolt together, and now you're sitting here. So I flew around and came back again, and I'm still here.
I was probably the odd one out in my class, because every weekend all my friends would go out together and that, but I just, 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, got in the car with Dad, went to the airfield, and come home at 9 o'clock at night and did the same on a Sunday. I never wanted to do anything else. So, and for the first few years of the Harvard flying, I don't think many other people flew in it. I think pretty much everywhere Dad went, I went.
After I'd done the Harvard, there was just so many parts in the Harvard, like, for instance, the spray booth, you spray maybe 50 components. Your arm's fit to drop off, and you think, oh, I'm never going to do this again. And then 2 weeks later, you're spraying the next lot, and then you put it all together, and eventually, when it's flown, you never want to do another airplane again. And then eventually, you get looking around and things, and think, well, I'm a bit bored now. I must occupy my time with something. So we then look for the next project.
Just across the road from the workshop where Morris and Leah work is the old wartime aerodrome of Eye. A ghost of itself now, really, an industrial estate, but once upon a time home to the 490th Bombardment Group. They flew Liberators first, and then Flying Fortresses, part of the massive war effort. An aerodrome built to Class A standards by the Black Battalions of the US Engineers. They made the aerodrome, it opened 1943, and at that time they were building over 100 aerodromes in East Anglia. At the peak of that period, 3 aerodromes a day opening up for the thousands of young men to come over who flew with the mighty 8th Air Force from East Anglia, I being one of the later bases that opened. But it made its contribution. Some 22 aircraft lost flying from the 490th. It was also a little bit unusual in that it had both Fortresses and Liberators on the aerodrome. The effect of the American presence in East Anglia, the friendly invasion, was a legacy of friendship that's carried on through the decades, and young people like Leah have picked up this. She's recognised that there's no memorial on Eye Aerodrome, unlike most of the other airfields, and Leah is now putting a lot of effort into correcting that, to honour the airmen that served on that base that is so close to her home and to her heart.
Yeah, the memorial project was started up probably about 18 months ago. The sole aim was to put a black granite memorial on the airfield somewhere, because there isn't an actual stone memorial on the airfield. There is a Lichgate memorial in the local village of Broome, which was where all the housing side of the accommodation side of the airfield was. But to us, with all the changes on the airfield, it needed to be something there, which was why we started, and we raised the money over about a 12-month period. We got Heritage Lottery funding as well to support the event, with cooperating with the high school and getting the kids involved in the project, doing notice boards that are going to go around the airfield to say this is what was here, this is, you know, then and now picture sort of thing. And now we're going through all the planning processes, the memorial stones on order. That should be going in the next 8 weeks. There's several crash sites around the actual runways with fully laden bombers that crashed after takeoff. There's 2 Mustangs crashed at Eye, one into the back of the village shop. And there's like a whole triangle of different incidents which will all be, we'll all have crash markers when we finished all our heritage trail that's going to go around the airfield, so all those locations won't be forgotten. We had several locations offered to us at Eye. The airfield is divided up into many different ownerships, and the landowners were really generous offering us pieces of land, but the more you look into some of them, the more they're going to cost for access and car parking to get cars off the road, and council didn't approve, all this sort of thing. So in the end we approached the council, Mid Suffolk Council, and they offered us that piece of land because it's just scrubland and it's got to stay green. And going with the council, they've got the planning, and it won't be moved because that area won't be touched. So just near where the memorial will be placed was the fuel dump for the base at Eye, and a little bit beyond that there was the hard standings where they had their airfield hacks, which I think was a Thunderbolt and a Harvard. Near, ironically, where the location is about 100 yards from the house I grew up in and where our engineering company is. And there's some nice shots around of B-17s taken off on the runway with the houses all in the background, which is where the memorial location is, so that was quite a nice picture to have. We had a wartime weekend in Eye to put the town back to how it would have been. No cars, no, you know, all that. And at the end of that weekend we'd had a roll of honour made that lists all of the names of the men who lost their lives flying from Eye, and we had that all painted onto an oak board to be hung in Eye Town Hall, so anybody can go and see it and it won't ever be moved. And yeah, we had 2 of the American servicemen came over and folded the flag, and it was very moving. I think we all really, I feel it now, we all really felt it. It was really, it was emotional.
The appeal has taken its first steps to get a memorial for the 490th Bomb Group in place, and Leah takes time out to walk the still intact former runway in the wheel tracks of the massive bombers that once thundered into the air, and reflect on the progress to date.
Most of the World War II airfields have gone, and they just dig up the runways and their housing estates, or, you know, so here we're still fortunate you've got one full runway and parts of the other 2 runways, so, you know, they may use it for the industrial use, but at least it's still here. To bring the families down, especially on the runway where you can stand and think that this is where your relatives were, this is where they flew from, and if you were standing here you would have seen them take off and land. And the memorial to us, especially to those who lost their lives, it's just for the families to come back and just know that that hasn't been forgotten, and what they did will never be forgotten, and once the memorial's there, it's there forever.
Eye isn't the only wartime airfield that holds a special place in the hearts of the Hammond family. Most US AAF airfields were arranged in groups, one supporting the other. One of the 490th's sister bases was Thorpe Abbotts, just a few miles away. And it's the story of an ill-fated B-17 Flying Fortress and the squadron hack transport from this 100th Bomb Group site that has inspired the colour scheme proudly worn by the Hammond Harvard.
We have a close tie with Thorpe Abbotts. We've got some friends in the States that were, Charlie was a captain on B-17s, and we were really close friends with their family, and so that we used to visit Thorpe Abbott's all the time. So that was really why it went into a Thorpe Abbott scheme, and you know, our Jeep is painted up in Thorpe Abbott's markings because of that tie with that family.
Thorpe Abbott's was home to the Bloody 100th, the 100th Bombardment Group, heavy bombers, flying fortresses. They had an unenviable reputation as the Bloody 100th because of their grievous losses. They weren't the highest of losses in the entire 8th Air Force, but they took punishment in some severe packages dealt out by the Luftwaffe that gained them this reputation, and that reputation went round the 8th Air Force bases, so much so that some were nervous if you got posted to the Bloody 100th. With his Harvard, Morris pays tribute to another aircraft, a bomber of the 100th Bomb Group. Fools Rush In, a B-17 with classic nose art, an aircraft, many missions, and then tragically on the 31st of December 1944, hit by flak and even more horrifically plunged downwards and collided with another B-17. Crews around watched horrified as both aircraft fell from the sky in pieces. Just one parachute was seen.
It's often forgotten that the air war claimed many servicemen's lives unconnected with the actual flying and fighting. There were ground accidents and training mishaps. It's a point, though, never lost on Leah and her father Morris.
We're cleaning the hangar roof off in preparation to spray some paint on it, and I just walked onto a skylight and 21-foot plummet to the concrete. And I had a free ride in a helicopter. Left hip. And yeah, there were no airplanes in the hangar, but where I fell through, normally the Mustang would have been, the tailplane of the Mustang. So had I hit the Mustang, it would have been easier to repair the Mustang than me.
It was horrible. I remember I was here at the time and they just said he'd had an accident. They didn't tell me how he was or anything like that. Yeah, it was horrible. And seeing him in hospital suddenly helpless, where I've never known him to be helpless before.
Unlike many of his predecessors airside at Hardwicke, and despite severe injuries, Morris did recover and come home, living to fight another day. As the Second World War passed into its third year, the shortage of men on the home front meant America needed a formalised women's organisation in military support.
Mrs. Ovita Culp Hobby taking the oath of office as Director of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. The Secretary of War appointed her on May 16, 1942, to organize, train, and command a force of women to take the places of men behind the lines. A big order. Already partially filled. Thousands of WACs, trained and disciplined the Army way, are now on duty all over this country and overseas, but thousands more are needed. Women from all walks of life. In our pioneer days, women held the powder horn for their fighting men. Today, they are joining the WAC. With practice, they improve, become trim, neat, military. But WACs on the move, into the field, all of them, to take over the duties for which they have been trained. Self-reliant, self-sustaining units, trained to settle quickly in new quarters, to get down to their job without delay. Taking over important jobs for the Army, through these replacements playing a vital role in winning the war.
As well as a woman's Army Corps, there was a recognised need for Air Force personnel, especially in aircraft movement behind the front line. Britain had the ATA, and America began to organise its women in the same way.
The first female pilot, Elise de la Roche, said that flying wasn't so much physical strength as coordination, mental coordination. And by the time America entered the war, and Great Britain was already in the war, there were thousands of female pilots, and their skills would be required, particularly in the UK, where many of them joined the heroic ranks of the Air Transport Auxiliary. Men and women that flew aircraft, that ferried aircraft from the manufacturers. They flew all sorts of aircraft. They flew heavy bombers, they flew fighters, and sometimes with scarcely more than a brief introduction and a notepad telling them what to do with that particular machine. And that has to be a real credit to the men and women of the ATA. In America, you had women like Jackie Cochran, who had spent some time with the ATA in the United Kingdom, apparently flew the first Hudson bomber over the Atlantic. She took those experiences back to America, and she badgered Hap Arnold, chief in Washington, to get more use from the women. They could contribute more. Similarly, Nancy Harkness Love, another socialite and aviating lady of the day, very skilled test pilot. She wanted to do her bit. These two women set up originally almost parallel units organising women. Eventually they formed the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and their job was to take aircraft, complex machines, B-26 Marauders, Mustangs, all sorts of aircraft, and take them and fly them to the places where the menfolk would collect these aircraft. Some of the women wanted to go further than that, but the regulations from Washington forbade them from going into combat. In flying accidents, 38 of the WASPs were killed. They ferried some 13,000 aircraft around to different bases during the war in all sorts of weather conditions, and they took the risks to make sure the aircraft were delivered and ready to be picked up and taken to war.
Leah is carrying on the tradition of the WASPs, not just on the ground, but also in the air, becoming a pilot herself at a young age and moving progressively through the aircraft types.
I think, if I remember rightly, Dad said the first time I flew I was 4, I think, in a Robin-off-I airfield. I was 16, I think, when I had my first flying lesson. And luckily a friend of ours, Phil O'Donoghue, was an instructor, and we used Old Buckingham as a licensed airfield. And we learnt in our Cessna over just under a 2-year period, which I tied in with the Great British Weather, doing it through as much as you could, because Hardwick's a grass runway, so through the winter we can't do a huge amount of flying, it's just too wet. And yeah, doing those and doing my written exams whilst doing my A-levels in between, much to my teacher's annoyance that I wouldn't do an extra A-level. But there's 7 written exams you have to do and study for. So gradually worked through those, especially over the winter months when you couldn't do the flying. And I did 48 hours in my training course. I got my licence. The CAA had it for 6 weeks, but they saved it and stamped it up on my 18th birthday. So I got it the day after my birthday. But yeah, it was a strange feeling to know that I'd actually done it.
I'm pretty pleased, really. So yeah, for her to achieve on her 18th birthday, actually get the licence, and to solo when she was 16 in an airframe that I'd restored and built the engine and stuff. And yeah, I was pretty pleased. I thought that was pretty cool.
My dad bought the Stearman and decided that I needed to go from the Oster to the Stearman, then to the Harvard. So yeah, when he brought that back from Land's End, that was my next progressive step from the Oster. It's a lot bigger, but it's sturdier, it's very draggy. It's a 450 horsepower, so it's got a lot of power, gets off the ground really quick. But as soon as you come over the threshold of the runway, you pull the throttle back, pull the stick up, it just runs out and it just lands really gently. It's a lovely aeroplane to fly. Well, every time I flew the Stearman, and you park it up and you just point at the next one, and you're just like, okay. And then I flew with Tony, and he flew Harvards anyway, so he did a couple of flights in our Harvard just to get familiar with it. And one night Dad was walking somewhere, so he said, well, why don't you just taxi it around? Okay, so I had the lesson how to start it, and we just went to taxi up and down the runway, and Dad was walking up the side of the runway, and he's just sitting there going like this, like, go flying. And I remember saying to Tony, I said, I'll go flying, but I want nothing to do with the landing. I said, I'll get it off the ground, I'm fine, but the landing is yours. And so we lined up at the end of the runway and went, and that was it. So I hadn't intended to go flying when I first flew it. Once you get airborne, the aeroplane is so stable, even on like a windy, bumpy day, it just sits there and purrs along lovely. But we flew around locally, and Tony didn't know the area that well, so he said, well, get me set up on like a finals, I'll tell you where to put all the flaps and power settings and things, which he did. And we were coming down the approach, and he was like, well, so I'll land it now. And I'm like, no, actually, I don't feel too bad. So I landed it on the first flight as well, which was a novel experience. I hadn't expected to, but from that minute on, I was just like, I couldn't wait to go flying again.
I taught her most of my bad habits, which are not very good habits sometimes. Some will get you into trouble, some will get you out of trouble. But yeah, when I knew that she'd done her first solo in it, I was just thought, well, that's it. That's how it was. You can't force people to do things, and it's either they want to do it or they don't. It's in the blood or not. And yeah, Leah does a pretty good job flying the Harvard. I have to admit. You know, the Harvard is a very good trainer, but it has some bad voices, as does the Mustang in one area. But, you know, once you're fully aware of those and understand it, then it's absolutely no problem.
People they always say, when are you going to fly the Mustang? And I'm just like, well, I just love flying the Harvard. And it's, you know, it's so graceful. You go long distance flying, you trim it out, it just sits there. And I mean, it was a trainer, it's designed to catch people out, but as long as you know and anticipate what it's going to try and do, then it's not too bad. But my dad always said to me when I first started to learn to fly, he said, you've never landed a Harvard until you finish tying it down. So that always sticks clear in my mind, that just because you think you're down and on the ground, there's always something else that could happen. So as long as you're anticipating it. But I don't know, I just love it.
The impressions created and memories stirred by the Hammond family flying collection at Hardwicke honour all those who served, at home and abroad, men and women. Leah has been born into the aviation heritage, but has also embraced the spirit of her sister pilots before her. Her aircraft, the T-6 Harvard, partnered with its Mustang big brothers in the hangar, really is a living, flying memorial to all the pilots and crew who served and often died on the aerial front line in Europe. Immaculately restored from a neglected Portuguese Navy museum piece, it reaches out not only to the families of airmen, but, through Leah's efforts on the ground and in the air, uniquely to the women in service and industry at the time, lest they ever be forgotten. The Hardwicke Harvard and its female pilot has become a familiar sight in the skies over the former US AAF bases in England, and as her skills increase, it can only be a matter of time before Leah makes the move her predecessors never did, to the controls of a front-line fighter. The final chapter in this story, the erection of the memorial at Eye, has yet to be told. But today, Leah is on a sortie to fly over the site and her family home as that day draws near.
Brakes are on, temperature's good. RPM drops, manifold pressure goes up. Set the prop to 2000. We've got hydraulic pressure. Flaps to 10. Trims are set. Throttle friction is tight. Mags are on both. Primer is in and locked. Controls are full and free. You all strapped in okay? Harley arms, golf mag tails ready for departure. Oh Roger, and rolling. Temperatures and pressures are good. I've never displayed it yet. I followed Dad around to air shows mainly. Wherever the Mustang goes, the whole crew from Hardwick tend to mass formate to that air show, or we'll just go somewhere for a cup of tea, or it's great. It's the best way to get around. You just enjoy the day that you're flying on. Obviously you're keeping an eye on the aeroplane itself, but once it's all trimmed out on a nice day, it just sits there, flies itself, so you can have a look around, keep an eye out for other aeroplanes, and just enjoy it. It's just lovely. Out of all the aeroplanes I wanted to fly, it's this one, and even over the Mustang I would rather fly this one. It's such a prolific event to have happened, and you live in East Anglia, you live in the middle of where all the airfields were, the base, and there's museums. It's just everywhere, and especially with the aeroplanes that we've got, it's just special. And you can support people that like the same thing. It was a traumatic time, and it shouldn't be forgotten. The men that died shouldn't be forgotten, and we help it carry on. It's one thing that you always get that lump in your throat around Remembrance Day because of what it's for. When they play the minute silence, and it is emotional because we're so tied in with it, and we've got so many friends still in the States, and the amount of people you get on like social media now to send you a message saying my granddad flew from here, and they've come over from the States, and it's nice they can come and see the airfield's still there. It's like a living history. When they come back, they're always very emotional, and that really gives you the lump in your throat when you talk to them.
This young British woman and the people of the 490th Memorial Project are preserving the memory of those Americans who fought to keep us all free.
Leah continues the tradition of the female pilots. Some of the men called them petticoat pilots, but boy were they much stronger than that. And Leah carries that on because she is a skilled airwoman in flying an aircraft as difficult as the Harvard can be. And she's flying onwards now through the heavens, carrying on a customer tradition, a legacy, an airborne legacy.